Okay, this is a history of philosophy of psychiatry interview, oral history with K.W.M. Bill Fulford, dated 7/1/2010. Thank you, Bill, for your willingness to participate in this interview.
Well, it's a great initiative, John. Thank you for organising it.
You're welcome. Tell us a little bit about what you consider the milestones in the development of contemporary philosophy of psychiatry.
Well, I guess an early milestone was the sort of British and American groups appearing, I think spontaneously either side of the Atlantic, and then hearing about each other. And of course we had that meeting that Michael Schwartz organised at his home. And a lot of things moved from there. The Royal College group was set up by myself with David Foreman and Sid Block originally. And Sid Block went on to do ethics basically, and David really dropped out of academic psychiatry. But then we had a very good committee with people like Gwen Adset and many others on it, and our two groups sort of developed relatively separately, I think, in the sense that we were very much part of an institution and you were very much independent institution, but of course we had our collaboration over PPP, which I think was our second milestone. Was it Phil Slavny who took us to JHUP for that?
And Paul McHugh.
Paul McHugh, and that was really...
Both of them.
Yeah. I mean, we did have a publisher in Britain, but a very nice publisher, a small academic publisher, but it wouldn't have got us the credibility that obviously Johns Hopkins Press gave us. And then I suppose there were of course a number of other groups got moving, and it was a sort of mobilisation of an interest that was already there. That's the way I saw it. So in France and Germany, Scandinavia, of course, people just appeared and got going on things and set stuff up around the world. And then I guess the next thing was the international network was quite an important milestone, which we launched with Verdi van Staten's help from South Africa. Actually, that's not quite chronologically right, because I think that was 2003. The network was it 2002, 2003, and we by then already, of course, got the international conferences going. So the network was set up really to coordinate that, and also, of course, the book series, which also happened off the back of the Florence conference, the Millennium Conference with Nature and Narrative from Oxford University Press. I guess my centre at Warwick was the first academic centre, so getting the funding for that and getting that set up, that must have been about 95, I think. I'm very bad on dates, but that was quite a milestone. And then, of course, Derek Bolton set up his centre at King's College, and then Tim Thornton eventually migrated from Warwick to set up the centre at UCLan. And I think, I forget again the chronology, but of course we then had a number of important European chairs, Gerrit Glass's chair in the Netherlands, Giovanni Sangolini, who recently got full professor but was very early with the chair in this subject. Thomas Fuchs recently got an important chair, which he's got state funding for in Heidelberg, the Karl Jaspers chair for the Philosophical Foundations of Psychiatry. So quite a strong academic movement within Europe, supported by a continuing programme of academic conferences, newsletters and so on in the States, and with this very strong collaboration over PPP. Then I think most recently a very significant milestone is the establishment of the chair in Pretoria, which is Verdi van Staten's chair, which is the first non-European chair, and that I think is quite a critical kind of hinge point for us, where that will take us. So really a lot of things, difficult to say which are the key milestones, there's been a lot of people doing some very exciting and innovative things, and it's developed into what is now a very strong European North American movement, and with now 1-2 very potentially exciting initiatives in other parts of the world.
Let's go back to the founding of the Royal College Group. You mentioned 3 key individuals. How was this conceived? How did the idea come up? What were the factors that sort of inspired or caused this phenomenon?
Well, it was a sort of conjunction of things, really. The work that I was doing in Oxford, I was sort of interested in philosophy and psychiatry. I had trained at the Maudsley and hadn't been much interested in it there, although I knew that 2 or 3 of the people there were pretty good philosophers, John Wing and Michael Shepherd among them. And then in Oxford I discovered that there'd been 2 or 3 other people doing PhDs who had either medical or psychiatric qualifications. Grant Gillette was one of them. Grant, who got the Magdalen Prize Scholarship with a PhD with Kathy Wilkes. And the American chap who, can't remember his name, come back to him, who's the chap who became Provost of Harvard or somewhere? Do you know who I mean?
Stephen Hyman?
No, not Stephen Hyman. We were talking about him the other day, and he did a big book on mind and brain and things, and then...
Hundert.
Ed Hundert?
Hundert, yeah. Well, Ed Hundert was actually a student of Geoffrey Warnock's at the same time as me. We were both his PhD students. And Geoffrey was a very warm, encompassing sort of chap, and he never thought to sort of introduce us. And I only discovered that Ed Hundert had been Geoffrey Warnock's student at the same time as me when his book came out. So, you know, there was a sort of Laurie Resnick was the other one doing he did a DPhil with in the philosophy of science with Bill Newton Smith, and we were all there, and not atypically of Oxford, we didn't bump into each other, we didn't know about each other until we'd all sort of finished our PhDs, and then gradually heard about each other through other routes. And that made me think that maybe there were more people out there doing or interested in philosophy and psychiatry and neuroscience. And there wasn't an obvious way of sort of discovering them. And the Royal College set up a new category of section called special interest groups. And you had to get 50 members to establish a group. And there was a process for advertising for a group. So we got permission to advertise for a philosophy special interest group, and I expected to find perhaps 10, 15 people. And I thought that although we wouldn't have enough to establish a group, we'd at least find out who was around, kind of thing. Well, we got our 50 people in a week, and it just grew exponentially. I think our second year, we used to put up a stall at the Royal College meetings, like, your country needs you type stalls, recruiting people. And I think in our second year, must have been about the second year, the president of the college at the time, Jim Burley, who was very much one of our supporters, he came up to me with this queue of people wanting to join the philosophy group, and said, Billy said, this philosophy group, it's taking over the college. You can't have special interest groups doing that. So they were very supportive, and we had a very good administrator at the time helping us, Jean Wales, who actually helped us organise the first international conference. And after about 3 or 4 years, we were the second biggest group in the college. So the big clinical sections, most of them were smaller than the philosophy so-called special interest group. The only group that was bigger was the general adult psychiatry group. So it sort of was one of those things that it just needed a spark to light it, and then suddenly things were there. A similar experience with Verdi van Staten's group in South Africa, where Verdi announced a group at the beginning of one of the South African meetings, and the South African Society for Psychiatrists meetings, they get psychiatrists from all over Africa. So a lot more people than in actual South Africa, and by the end of the conference they had more members of the philosophy group than there were in the South African Society of Psychiatrists, as far as I remember. So that sense of lighting, you know, something that just lit people up, and they suddenly all wanted, you know, it was like water in a dry land. It was something they were looking for. And so
I'd like you to say more about what do you think what the attraction was? What was driving, what need was this philosophy of psychiatry development meeting in psychiatrists at that time?
It's very hard to say. I mean, I haven't found the same interest in other groups of doctors. Other groups of doctors are interested in the practical payoffs, but so like values-based practice, but mind and brain, free will, those sort of big philosophical topics, I guess it's sort of ringing bells for people when they work in psychiatry, that they're bumping up against these problems in a way that you don't in other disciplines. It may also be something about the kind of people who go in for psychiatry, because they tend to be people who, you know, I don't mean this unkindly to our colleagues, but they tend to be very much thinking people. My experience is that a very high proportion of people in psychiatry have really quite considerable skills in other areas of the humanities. A lot of musicians, a lot of artists, and so it's possibly something about the kind of people who go into psychiatry. It's something about the kind of problems that we run into day to day in psychiatry, and the kind of clinical challenges that we're presented with. That a sense that important as the you know, developments in more biological methods are, that they're not enough. And I think actually Alan Francis sort of summed it up, because he did a foreword, as you know, to the book that you did with Michael Schwartz and I think Ozzy Wiggins on psychiatric diagnostic classification, which was timed to come out alongside DSM-4. And Alan Francis did the foreword, as I remember, and basically said, I'm not a philosopher, but I can tell you the problems we've run into doing DSM-4 demand philosophical, they are philosophical problems as much as scientific problems, they're conceptual problems. I don't know whether you guys can help us, but we have, for me, it's been a process of recognising the kind of problem I'm dealing with. And I think there's that sense that the kind of problem we're dealing with, philosophy may not have the answers, but at least it's addressing the same problems.
So it was those, it was in a sense there's kind of an unmet need that clinicians have?
A learning readiness. A learning readiness. The other thing that was very interesting at the time was that Gwen Adsaid, who was one of the first committee members with us, suggested that we did some sort of market research to see what members of the college as a whole thought about philosophy. And so we constructed this little questionnaire, and we loaded it deliberately so that it wasn't just, do you think philosophy is a good thing? It was, do you think philosophy should be taught and examined in the college's exams? So it was making people think about it in a very practical way. It's fine just to say philosophy is a good thing, but if it's going to be taught and examined, that's the question. So the question was, do you think philosophy should be taught in the MRC psych? And you could say, I think it's a terrible idea, or neutral, I think it's a really good idea. And then we asked them, it was very short, we had a general question, and we had a series of sort of specific areas like philosophy of mind, jurisprudence and so on. And we loaded it again by distributing this questionnaire at a biological psychiatry meeting on the latest antidepressant or something. And we distributed with the agreement of the chair of the meeting, we distributed these questionnaires on the seats at coffee time. It was in the days when everything was done by hard copy. And the first thing that was extraordinary was that we got about 70–75% return rate from these questionnaires. And the second thing was that was extraordinary was that over 50% of these people at a biological psychiatry meeting said that philosophy should be examined in the MRC psych. And by philosophy, it wasn't just ethics, that we included ethics as a topic, but it was also jurisprudence, philosophy of mind, conceptual analysis, and one other area that got over 50%. It was a huge positive response, but over 50% for those pretty, you'd think pretty arcane subjects. And these weren't people who signed up for the philosophy section, these were people attending a biological psychiatry meeting. So there was definitely a sense there of, philosophy has something, at least it's addressing the same areas that we're concerned about. And so there was that interest there, and it was very much a sort of learning readiness for it, I think.
How did you find out about the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry?
By telepathy, I think. Well, not my telepathy, Michael Schwartz's telepathy, because Michael heard about the Royal College Group when he was setting up the, coordinating people around the American group, and he didn't know, he'd heard my name, but he didn't know how to contact me, so he rang the Royal College of Psychiatrists and was put through to Jean Wales, who was the special interest group officer, and I was in Jean Wales's office at the time talking to her about the next conference, and she picked the phone up and it was Michael Schwartz ringing from the States and trying to contact Phil Fulford, and she said, "I'll pass you right over."
It's like she was your personal secretary.
It was just an extraordinary coincidence, because I would be in there once every 6 months, because I dealt with Jean mostly by phone, but I was in there because we were organising the next conference, and Michael rang when I was actually sitting next to Jean Wales organising this conference, and so it went on from there. Yeah.
Telepathy or fate.
Yeah, but it was extraordinary.
So then what was the substance of that conversation and what happened next?
Well, just that Michael said, I gather you're doing some stuff in England, that we're doing some stuff in America. Then he invited me to that meeting that he organised at his home, and the relationship just developed from there. So it was as simple as that. Let's get together. It was in the early days. Nobody quite knew where we were going, and I got on very well with Michael, and it was a good partnership.
So in those early days, you said no one really knew where we were going, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you thought we were going or should go back in those early days.
Well, I had a fairly simple-minded approach, which was that if the subject was going to be anything other than just a sort of talking club, we needed to develop a strong institutional structure, and we needed the sort of tools of a strong institutional structure. So we needed a journal, we needed library resources, we needed teaching programs, we needed to get research money, we needed to get funding, we needed to set up academic departments, establish chairs, and all the rest of it. And I didn't have any particular order of doing this in mind, but I did. I just looked out for opportunities and for people who could make these different things happen, and it was really as practical as that. As far as subject matter goes, my own interest has always been very much in analytic value theory, but it was quite clear from the little bit of philosophy I'd done in other areas that there really wasn't an area of philosophy that wasn't relevant to the work we were doing in one way or another. So again, it was a matter of being opportunistic about finding philosophers who were interested and could be got interested in psychiatry and building on that. Anthony Quinton was a good example, because Anthony Quinton, in Oxford we used to have guest lectures from philosophers every now and again, because Michael Gelder was very sort of inclusive he was quite a strongly behaviourist psychiatrist himself, and but he was very supportive of what I was doing as a younger man, sort of in my PhD in research and things. And so one of the people invited was Anthony Quinton, who was a very well-known philosopher at the time, went on to become Lord Quinton. And Anthony thought he'd better brush up a bit on some psychiatry, so he read up on delusion and decided that that was something that looked pretty interesting philosophically. He gave this lecture, which was pretty competent. You know, he was a very bright guy, he could read up on these things quite quickly. And I went and had a chat with him afterwards, and I said, you know, there's one or two subtleties about delusion. And I told him about the delusion of mental illness. And of course, as a philosopher, his eyes lit up to that point. And to cut a long story short, he went on to, well, he wrote then a much better article about delusion, pointing out that this was a very rich area of philosophers, and a number of philosophers now, of course, are working on that. People like Martin Davis, John Campbell and so on, at a very high level. But he also became a very strong supporter of the Philosophy Special Interest Group, and did a number of lectures for us, and he published in some of the early books we did and so on. And he was one of my examiners in my DPhil, and after that supported me in getting my first book published. So it was a sort of an opportunity of somebody who'd kind of slightly serendipitously stumbled into psychiatry, and I knew enough about philosophy to know what would hook him, as it were. Mm-hmm. And once he was hooked, he got very interested, and as a very senior figure in British philosophy, became a strong supporter and made a lot of things happen for us. So it's that sort of process. I couldn't have planned that, but because I knew broadly where we needed to go, I was ready to kind of hook the fish in when the fish came along, as it were, if I can speak of Anthony in that slightly disrespectful way.
You make it sound as if that the philosophers' participation in the philosophy of psychiatry movement in Britain just happened by accident, that there was no premeditation?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was certainly premeditation in the sense that I and a number of others looked out for people that would be interested. There were also a number of philosophers who were interested. There was Kathy Wilkes in Oxford, and of course Jonathan Glover, Rom Harry, who's still very active in the movement. And these were people who had written Philosophy of Psychiatry. There wasn't at that stage an actual movement, there wasn't a sort of definable discipline with a large number of people behind it, but these were, in Jonathan Glover's MPhil thesis was on responsibility, and he looked at responsibility through the lens of a range of different psychopathologies, and this was in his 20s. And he went on to do, of course, the book on personal identity, and he again has been a wonderful supporter of the subject, always willing to turn out and give lectures and that sort of thing. And Kathy Wilkes sadly died a few years ago, but you know, she was interested in, as a philosopher of mind, she was interested particularly in identity disorders, and wrote that book, Real People, Philosophy Without Thought Experiments. Mm-hmm. So there were people doing philosophy of psychiatry. Anthony Clinton wasn't, but was a very key chap to bring in when on that opportunity, because of his very extensive political and commercial connections, as well as his obvious, you know, qualities as an academic. So there wasn't a sort of 5-year plan with a coherent structure behind it, but there was a clear objective and the sense of taking the opportunity to corral and marshal and you know, draw in these various people. But it depended hugely on their generosity and goodwill. My own supervisor, Mary Warnock, you know, she would always go to any lengths to support her students, and R.M. Hare, who was an incredibly hard man as a supervisor, but you know, he was tremendously supportive, and that whole generation, it was very much part of their way of doing philosophy, was to work really hard to support their younger generation, and I think we as a movement I hope are going to emulate that.
What sort of pushback and skepticism did you experience in those early days?
Not a lot. It was interesting because once the Philosophy Special Interest Group was launched, you see, we very quickly had some high-powered people on side. We had philosophers, well, certainly the Oxford philosophers, very much on side. We also had some very high-powered people in psychiatry, notably Martin Roth, who actually he just about finished being chair of philosophy of psychiatry in Cambridge, but he was the first president of the Royal College. He was knighted for his work in the neurosciences. He was like Anthony Quinton. He was a very, very bright guy, but also extremely well connected politically. And Martin had his big textbook, Slater and Roth, was premised on the idea that, this was when I read it as a medical student, it was sort of the big textbook, 40s, 50s, that sort of period. And it was premised explicitly on psychiatry having escaped from the trammels of philosophy and sociology and soft subjects like that. And when I'd done my DPhil, and before I'd actually been examined on it, my professor, Michael Gelder, said, the Oxford professor, I've got to send it to the Cambridge professor. And I said that he'll hate it. He said, well, anyway, I think you should send it to him because I'm sure he's a very cultured man, I'm sure he'd like to read it. So I duly sent it and got, in those days, a handwritten note from Martin Roth, come and see me, my boy. And I had my half-an-hour appointment with him, and when I arrived I was ushered into his study, and he was sitting there with this thesis on his knee, and I thought, you've just had a quick look, haven't you? But he'd actually read it, and he'd understood it, and he said to me, he asked me a few questions about it, which I was able to deal with. He said, I think it's a nice piece of work, but he said, I suppose when the neurosciences get going properly, which they appear to be, we won't have much need for this philosophy stuff, will we? And I sort of gulped slightly and said, well, actually, Sir Martin, I think it's possibly the opposite will be the case. He said, oh, really? Tell me why. So I started in the story, and he said, it's very interesting. And then he rang through to his secretary and said, have I got anything I can't cancel? And she said, well, no. So he said, well, cancel the rest of the day. So there I was with this really, the mafia boss of British psychiatry at the time. And we talked for the whole morning, and then he took me to lunch in Trinity College, where I was introduced to Brian Josephson, who was a famous theoretical physicist, another great hero of mine, and I had this wonderful opportunity to talk to Brian Josephson over lunch. Then we came back to his room and had the whole afternoon. He was completely tireless, Martin Roth, just going through these arguments and things. And by the end of the afternoon he said, I think there's something in this philosophy. He said, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. And that was it. And so he then became the first honorary president of the Philosophy Special Interest Group. Well, to have Martin Roth as our honorary president made us pretty bulletproof. And so we had people like Martin Roth essentially giving us headroom, policy headroom, and we had this groundswell of popular support, and it made it all, there wasn't much resistance. Where we have hit resistance is, interestingly, when it comes to the examination process. And I think the problem there is that I think it's a generational thing. I think the problem is that there aren't enough examiners who feel comfortable to examine in areas of philosophy. And so it's a vicious cycle. You can't get it into the curriculum properly. I mean, it's been in the Royal College curriculum for several years, but they don't do a great deal about it. There have been set questions for several years. It's there, but it's not picked up and used. And there's no easy way to move that forward, because we have to just wait until enough senior people have done enough philosophy to feel comfortable about including it, and including it in a way that's going to be relevant to the general examination and not just to the specialists.
You might want to tell me a little bit about how the continental European people interested in philosophy and psychiatry came into the fold. so to speak?
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it. I actually think it's possibly us coming into the fold from the analytic philosophy side, to be honest. I think the continental philosophers actually, and certainly through phenomenology, the philosophy of psychiatry never died, if I could put it that way. If you think of the way the tradition continued in Germany, and perhaps even more so in France and Italy, if you take philosophy in that broader sense, philosophy of psychiatry it continued through the 20th century. It was really very much, I think, in the British and North American traditions, more analytic philosophical traditions, perhaps harder science traditions on the medical side, that the philosophy disappeared. More or less, I mean, there were crucial points where it came through. There's the most obvious one is the contribution of Carl Hempel to the development of the ICD-8 glossary and then DSM-3. But then in that 1959 meeting in New York, where he presented the logical positivist model of science as separating theory from description, and Aubrey Lewis turned the argument round and said we need a descriptively based classification. And then Aubrey Lewis and Norman Sartorius spent a couple of afternoons in Geneva and wrote the glossary to ICD-8, which was the first symptom-based classification. And then that went on, of course, into ICD-9 and to DSM-3. So this was an absolutely critical point where an interaction between philosophy, the logical positivism of Carl Hempel, and the opportunism of Aubrey Lewis, who I never actually met, but I think was a man after my own heart, actually produced that critical development in our thinking about classification. So there were key contributions. There were things that somebody someday must do the history of ideas of the 20th century and look at the way in which philosophy and the mental sciences, as it were, psychology and psychiatry actually interacted over that period. But there was a tradition that continued in continental Europe through the phenomenological tradition, and that certainly I discovered, much to my personal enrichment, through people like Giovanni Stangolini and Thomas Fuchs and so on, and Christoph Mundt, and who were very generous and in their involvement, and were very pleased to find there was a movement in philosophy and psychiatry. And I think we brought, through the British and American groups in particular, we brought a sort of structural energy that helped to galvanise things. At a time when the continental phenomenology was under attack, I think, in a sort of belated biological psychiatry movement in Germany, and particularly in Germany, but to some extent in Italy and France. And of course in Scandinavia there was a continuing phenomenological tradition, continental philosophy tradition. So I don't think it's as simple as the continental philosophy disappeared. I don't think it's as simple as philosophy of psychiatry disappeared. I think it was that, particularly in the rather positivistic environment of, well, philosophical as well as scientific environment of British and North American philosophy, North American culture, that was pretty inimical to philosophical thinking in psychiatry. And that's it's sort of like a local desert rather than a worldwide phenomenon. But I could be completely wrong about that. Maybe my own sort of fantastical way of understanding how the history of the thing worked.
So it sounds like
certainly my impression was of finding a rich resource in the Giovanni Stangolinis and the Thomas Fuchs and the Christoph Mundts, and indeed people like Leonard Nordenfelt in Sweden and so on, and that became very much part of what made the international movement move so quickly, I think.
So what I'm hearing is you see yourself as being part of a larger tradition, but I wonder if you also see something unique or special about late 20th century philosophy of psychiatry that distinguishes it from prior traditions.
Well, I think energy and organisation, growth rates. I think our success on both sides of the Atlantic and throughout Europe and now in Africa and so on, in marshalling resources I think we've taken the process much further in terms of engagement with the research and service development initiatives, the links with service user engagement in psychiatry and so on. It's not so much that it wasn't there before, but I think what we've seen is a real explosion of activity in the area. And I guess what we brought to that is some energy and organisation and sort of vision about where we're going. But we were building on rich roots and generous traditions, I think.
So one of the ways, I mean, at this part in the interview, one of the ways we can think about the milestones is sort of organizationally with people, with organizational accomplishments. I now would like for you to turn your thoughts to more the intellectual content of the field and what you think the milestones have been, are, and place that in that intellectual tradition that you've mentioned just a few moments ago.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, there are certain kinds of ideas, topics, theoretical approaches, crucial insights that characterized late 20th century philosophy of psychiatry. And then there are novel ideas, or maybe there aren't. That's sort of why I'm asking. What's new in this field? What has this renaissance, so to speak, brought new to the tradition?
That's a very big question.
That's my job.
Well, I'm not sure I could answer that in any very coherent way. I mean, I think we've seen some very innovative work done in a number of areas of philosophy. But whether you could say, well, there's something equivalent to discovering the double helix in that sense, I'm not sure philosophy progresses in that way in any field. So it's a bit difficult to quite get what you're after there, John. I mean, I think if you look at the Oxford book series, for example, we've got some new thinking in a whole range of different fields that you can define either clinically or in terms of philosophical topic. But there's no grand theory that's emerged, I think. Maybe it's part of the function of philosophy to debunk grand theories when they pretend to emerge, if you see what I mean, in the history of ideas. It's a very different process, I think, from what would go on in an area of empirical science of a more conventional kind. I think one thing that is new is in my own field of value theory, is the extent to which theory is being translated into practice and actually, making changes to service organisation, to training, and through your work, particularly in the area of diagnosis and understanding how values come into diagnosis. So I think if we were to talk about an area where there's been a sort of coherent thrust from a particular theoretical perspective through into practical products, I would say that area of work on values is where there's been some very distinctive action that could make quite a difference, not just to psychiatry but to the rest of medicine.
Have there been moments, again, focusing on your own intellectual career, thinking about the ideas, not the activities, so to speak, or the organizational aspects, thinking about the ideas, are there important moments for you, crucial insights that you had that were influential in your own thought?
Well, anecdotal moments, certainly. And one of them was my first supervision with Mary Warnock when I did my DPhil, which was quite extraordinary because she of course was a very experienced supervisor. And I got into this. I never did a first degree in philosophy. I did some work on what I now see as the logic of values, and wrote this up when I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, and actually showed it to a chap called Charlie Mole, who was a New Testament theologian, and he said, "But this is philosophy, and would you like me to show it to Donald McKinnon, who was the professor of moral philosophy at the time?" And so I said, "Well, if you think you'd be interested," and so then Donald McKinnon took me on, just as you could in those days, as a pupil. And I was a medical student, but I did this, I was taught philosophy by Donald McKinnon. And then he organised for me to have some more in-depth teaching from Mary Warnock. And off the back of that, I wrote a couple of things, and then on the basis of written work, I got taken on to do a DPhil, so I didn't do a first degree. And the work I'd been doing was on logical values, essentially. And so it was natural that I was going to do my DPhil on the logic of values and write up these theories properly. And the first supervision, Mary Warnock said to me, "Have you ever thought about applying this work to medicine?" Because she said, "You are, after all, a doctor." And I said, "Well, that's a good idea. That'll make a good first chapter." It's been the last 40 years' work. So that was certainly a pivotal moment. The idea of bringing together my interest in the logic of value terms with medicine hadn't occurred to me, interestingly. It was something that it required a good supervisor to say, "Here's an idea you might want to play with." And of course I've been playing with it ever since. One day I'll get back to that theoretical work on values that's still sitting there in 3 notebooks waiting to be sort of written up properly. But so that was certainly a pivotal moment. And then the second one that I remember was because there's 2 broad sort of components to the work I did on values and concepts, and the first is to look at the way that values simpliciter come into defining concepts, and the second is to say, what is it about medical value in particular that defines concept? What is it that makes this a disease rather than ugliness or wickedness, that sort of thing? And as you know, the second strand is much more well, trickier really, but it's, in my work, it's cashed out through the idea of agency. But the big test of theories of disorder, in my mind, is to give an adequate account of delusion, because delusion is well, it's got all sorts of from a linguistic analytic point of view properties that any theory of disorder, including mental disorder, has to include delusion. So it's like a theory in the science, a scientific theory that's going to fit the data. It's got to fit the linguistic data on delusion. And I'd sort of written quite a lot of this stuff, but never quite cracked delusion. And the way I used to work was, when I was doing that book, was to do a minimum of 3 hours a day on the book. Was the only way of keeping it going, really. And I was actually in this room here on a February day when I had the flu and couldn't go to work, and the blooming central heating broke down. And February day in London with the flu, when the central heating breaks down, isn't pleasant. And I thought, oh, I can't do any work today. And I thought, yeah, I will do my 3 hours. So I actually sat, we had a table in there in those days, and I sat at the table with a blanket over my head because I was so cold. And I actually suddenly twigged how I could deal with delusion. And that was definitely a turning point, because in a way it was the keystone to the whole book, was that sort of trick of turning delusion. So that sort of was the second big milestone in my own work. And the
hold on just a second. Could you say a little bit more? I mean, here you are sitting in the dining room in your delirium with a blanket on your head, and you have a crucial insight into delusion. I mean, what was it, and what happened?
Well, it was essentially that the phenomenology of delusion maps onto the phenomenology of practical reasoning rather than of cognitive functioning. Just in a word. So, I mean, it's a bit of a long story, and not necessarily something I can talk about at this time of night with any coherence. but it was one of those things where suddenly the pattern clicked, and you know, I don't have the knowledge or skills to take that any further, but there are people who've played around with it. Richard Gitts has done some work on it in an interesting way. And action theory itself is coming back, of course, people like Jane Heal, although now she's retiring. So I think there are people, and there's a couple of PhD students in Garrett Glass's group who are working on agency and the kind of stuff I was doing in that book. I mean, it's not sort of easy stuff. It isn't the stuff that your colleagues are going to sort of pick up and find easy. But I believe it's that kind of, you know, nitty-gritty detail, it's the rigorous detail that will ultimately drive the subject forward, and that we need to hang on to, and I think we are hanging on to in the way the subject's developing. Then the third milestone was the values-based practice milestone, which wasn't quite so well deep, but and that was when we were on holiday in Switzerland by Lake Lucerne, and it was one of those occasions when I had been working very hard. I hadn't been working on this stuff at all, and I suddenly had this thought that why the hell don't we do something with values as they've done with evidence? And I just wrote the whole values-based practice theory out in, I think, 2 or 3 days, 2 days by the Lake Lucerne, and then a day sitting on the train coming back to the UK. And I've still got this, the Lucerne document, as I call it. And in those days I was still writing everything by hand, and so it sort of completed the cycle, because there was the Mary Warnock, this is over what, 25, 30 years, there was the Mary Warnock suggestion of linking the values up with the medicine, and then there was the whole sort of working through that defield and everything, and then finding a way of dealing with delusion within this action theory approach, and then the sort of breakthrough into practice with the values-based practice and how you might actually do that, drawing on the theoretical work that had been done in the working on the concepts of disorder. So those are, anecdotally, as I say, in my mind, those are the three things that I remember with continuing pleasure as sort of exciting moments.
Very good, thank you. What's surprised you the most about this endeavour?
The level of support from very senior people in all walks of life, really, and the generosity of support from people who know particular axe to grind and who've every reason not to be seen to be making fools of themselves by supporting things that might go pear-shaped, but nonetheless came through and supported us. And it's continuing. I mean, we've still got, you know, very good people supporting us.
And disappointments?
I'm not good on disappointments. I can't actually think of any, to be perfectly honest. We've certainly had some difficulties, but you know, you to say you don't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs.
What do you see, Bill, as the crucial questions for the field at this point in time?
I don't know about questions. I certainly think, well, I think there's
problems.
Yeah, well, I think there's two, not so much problems, there's two challenges for us. One is to build, well, to contribute to building an approach to working with mental distress and disorder that is much more in a partnership with people who are actually experiencing mental distress and disorder. And we've seen that at the UCLAN conference we've been at together this week. The challenge of that, and also how rich it is when you can start to make that partnership really work. So that's something that I believe our subject, you know, the philosophy of psychiatry, can contribute to, and is contributing to. And I think if we can build on that and continue to make it, to make that into a real partnership, I think that's something that's very important for the long-term future and health of the discipline. The other thing is more the sort of international perspective, that all this new work has been done off the back of sort of Anglo-American and continental philosophy, which represent about 25% of the great traditions of thought and practice around the world. So actually finding ways of building, again, partnership with other philosophical and practice traditions around the world, so that we have, what you can think of as an international learning set that's in a constant dynamic of exchange between the different traditions. That's the other thing that I believe is important for our long-term health and survival. And again, we have Ferdy van Stratten's chair, hopefully, is the first sort of bridgehead into breaking out of the dominance of a Western European, North American model of philosophy. Okay. Our symbol is diversity, and I think it's through that diversity that we'll continue to thrive and develop.
Do you think philosophy of psychiatry has one or more social values or value attached to it?
What do you mean by social value?
Worthwhileness.
Do you mean, do I think it's worthwhile, or do you mean in what way do I think it's worthwhile?
Do you think it's worthwhile to others?
Absolutely.
Tell us about that.
I mean, if by others you mean people who are not interested in philosophy and who are not interested in psychiatry, yes, I do. I believe that we're already making an important contribution beyond our own field. So yes, I think it's contributing to, in a broad sense, social capital.
Tell us what you mean by social capital.
Well, in the sense of the health of society and the resources and resilience of society, its ability to respond to change and challenge and so on, I think we're contributing. Not that that's the only reason for existence, but I think we do happen to be contributing to that. Yeah.
You've been one of the foremost leaders in this field. I don't think any or few people would dispute that. If you had wisdom or advice to give to junior colleagues, what would it be?
Gosh. Well, I think one is that although I'm perhaps treating slightly lightly the question of disappointments and problems, I think one is to recognise that all academic, if we're thinking of academics, all academic life is difficult, and it's not been easy for our generation, but it's going to be even harder for the next generation. With the, they're unlikely to have. I mean, frankly, I think certainly my generation wasn't particularly easy, but it was relatively feather-bedded compared to what they have to put up with nowadays. And to work in an interdisciplinary field is always going to be challenging. And once it ceases to be an interdisciplinary field, then it probably won't have any real, guts and interest to it. So, you take the rough with the smooth, it's going to be difficult, and you need to be careful and pragmatic about how you develop your career in the field. And so I suppose the first thing is be aware that it won't be easy, but it will be very rewarding. And the second is to focus on getting yourself as well qualified and as well supported as you can in your own primary discipline. And if you're a doctor and a psychiatrist, don't forget that you're a doctor and a psychiatrist first, and you need to be first class in your field. And the same for a philosopher. If we look at some of the brightest and best coming through the field now, they are first class philosophers. They're not people who can't make it in philosophy and therefore are doing something a bit dodgy in the margins. These are people who are first class in their field. Several of our colleagues that we met in Oxford today, and other people I've told you about. So the second thing is, it's going to be tricky, but nonetheless, you must really think carefully about your own primary discipline as your career, and pursue that rigorously. And I guess the third thing is to be, you will hit people who can't see the point of what you're doing and may try and knock you back, but also and expect that, and don't necessarily be put off by it. Listen to what people have to say, but don't necessarily be put off by people not understanding why and what you're doing, but also be very ready to find the people and respond to the people who are going to help you and who will understand what you're wanting to do and that are likely to be among the best in the field. So look out for the brightest and the best, and don't be surprised if they're willing to help you, is what I would say.
Okay. Are there any things that you have done differently, either in your intellectual work or in your practical organizational efforts?
It's another of these ones where I'm going to sound not much good on sort of worrying about what might have been. I think I don't. Given the resources and the opportunities we've had, I honestly don't think we could have done anything much differently. I suppose the only thing that I don't think we've done enough of is, we've all been so focused on driving the subject forward, we haven't thought about what's coming along behind us enough. So, much as I'm not a structures person, I'm not good at committees and that kind of thing, I do actually think that we probably, and we are giving some attention to this now, of course, but I think that sort of more conscious process of thinking, what are the structures that allow somebody, one of your residents approaches you, wants to talk about, interested in philosophy, how do we provide structures and opportunities for people to progress, if they're good, to progress through the system and eventually maybe even get a chair in the subject, but certainly to get a chair in psychiatry where they've got a real interest in the philosophy and can support people, or they've got a chair in philosophy and they can take a real interest in people coming through from the mental health side. It's that sense of, at the moment it's very hit or miss how a person would progress through the system. Funnily enough, I think Gerrit Glass in the Netherlands has probably got the best sort of institutional and structural setup to allow people to really think about a career in philosophy of psychiatry.
Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think he's got I think between him and a number of other colleagues, there seems to be an awful lot, that there's a much, there's a much richer culture of particularly PhD students coming through the system, and that's the kind of thing we need to be looking to build, I think.
I see. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think it's important to share?
What about, why did you get involved in the philosophy of psychiatry?
Why did you?
Couldn't do anything else.
Now come now, you just said it's the other way around just a minute ago.
No, I think it, in a way it was because I couldn't do anything else, but I was always interested. I was really going to be a biologist, and I fell into doing medicine because for entirely personal reasons I wanted to get to Cambridge a year early, and I got in on a sort of scholarship stream a year early, as on the basis that I would do medicine rather than biology. So, and then because I didn't really want to do medicine, I spent my time going to C.S. Lewis's lectures on Middle English and writing this stuff on values, which, as I say, I was doing really because I was thinking of it as an aspect of theoretical biology, and that's what got me into doing philosophy. So I was a sort of accidental doctor and then became an accidental philosopher, and I suppose those two accidental processes ended up with me bringing the two together when it took me right through till I did my DPhil, and that first supervision with Mary Warnock and her saying to me, you know, have you thought about applying this stuff to medicine? So it wasn't quite that I couldn't have done anything else, but it wasn't a well thought out plan of life that got me into the, and I actually did quite a bit of immunology soon after when I finished qualifying as a doctor, and I have a whole series of incomplete research agendas in bacteriology and immunology that if I had another 500 years I would be definitely pursuing. So I could have gone down other streams, but I think insofar as you sort of have a feel of where your real appetition is driving you, and it was towards the more theoretical questions, and so and psychiatry is the one area of medicine where those more theoretical questions go live as part of the thirst that I think people have for philosophy, and so that's sort of what drew me ultimately to have to make. You've only got probably 30 years to really make something of it, and you haven't got 300 years, and you have to choose. So
okay,
that's how I got into it.
We just have another minute, but you haven't said anything about psychiatry. Why psychiatry and philosophy?
Well, psychiatry because it was the only thing I was any good at as a medical student, interestingly. And I wasn't particularly interested in people in those days. I was a theoretician. It was just that there was something, I suppose because psychiatry is more conceptual, that I had an aptitude for it, that my colleagues who were good at remembering the course of this, that, or the ulnar nerve and so on, they didn't like the ideas and I didn't like the facts, and so I had an aptitude for it, and I saw it as if I was going to pursue more philosophical research rather than empirical research, it was the area where you could do it, because there were clearly conceptual problems in psychiatry that were demanding answers in a way that there weren't in cardiology or indeed neurology, which was my other big interest.
We're out of time. Thank you so much for...
Thank you, John, for the initiative. Very much appreciated. Good.